Her voice sliced through the quiet kitchen like a knife. "You'll die with nothing, Harold! Nothing! Don't you get it?" Melissa slammed her palm on the table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the wood as she sneered at me. The words rang in my ears louder than any machine I'd ever worked on in the shop during my younger years. My son, Daniel, sat beside her, his head lowered, eyes glued to the floor like a boy too afraid to challenge his mother. Except he wasn't a boy. He was my son, a grown man, too weak to defend me against his wife's venom. I had tried to keep my composure, but my hands shook as I gripped my worn cap, the same one I wore every day since retirement. The humiliation burned worse than the arthritis in my joints. She wanted me out, discarded, erased from the family I had built with my bare hands. "Dad, Melissa just thinks it would be better if you consider the assisted living facility we showed you last month." Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about the money." "Of course it's about the money," Melissa cut him off, her designer bracelet jingling as she gestured wildly. "Your father's house is worth 3 times what he paid for it, and he's living there alone, letting it fall apart. It makes no financial sense." I looked at my son, searching for the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to change oil, to stand up for what was right. I couldn't find him anywhere in that downcast face. "The house was your mother's dream," I said quietly. "We saved for 15 years to build it. Every nail, every floorboard has a memory." Melissa rolled her eyes. "Memories don't pay bills, Harold, and frankly, you're becoming a burden. Daniel spends half his weekends fixing things around your place when we could be networking, making connections." I couldn't breathe inside that house anymore. The walls of their modern, sterile home seemed to close in on me. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting with a familiar ache. "I think I'll head home now," I said, trying to maintain whatever dignity I had left. "Dad," Daniel started, finally looking up at me. "Let him go." Melissa waved dismissively. "Maybe a walk will help clear his head about what's really practical here." The autumn wind bit against my face as I shuffled down the street, each step heavier than the last. I didn't even notice where I was going until I saw the neon glow of Riverside Diner, its yellow sign flickering against the darkening sky. I pushed the door open, seeking nothing more than a cup of coffee to quiet my racing heart. The bell jingled softly above me, and the familiar scent of coffee and pie wrapped around me like an old friend. Some faces I recognized nodded in greeting, people I'd fixed cars for over the decades. I chose a booth in the corner, away from windows, away from prying eyes that might notice the defeat etched into every line on my face. "Coffee, Harold?" Betty, the longtime waitress who'd served me and Margaret on our Saturday morning dates for years, approached with a steaming pot. "Please," I nodded, grateful for the simple kindness in her tone, something I hadn't heard from my family in months. As Betty poured the coffee, I noticed an elderly man at the counter turn slowly in my direction. He was well-dressed in an old-fashioned way, pressed slacks, a button-down shirt with a sweater vest, and a leather briefcase at his feet. What struck me most were his eyes, pale blue and intense, studying me with a strange curiosity that made me shift uncomfortably. "Everything all right?" Betty asked, noticing my discomfort. "Fine," I mumbled, wrapping my weathered hands around the warm mug. I stared into the black liquid, seeing Margaret's face reflected there. What would she think of our son now? Of the woman he'd chosen? Of me, unable to hold the family together after she was gone? I was lost in these thoughts when I felt a presence beside my table. Looking up, I found the elderly man standing there, his briefcase now clutched in his hands. Up close, I could see he was older than me, perhaps in his early 80s, with a distinguished bearing despite his age. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gravelly yet steady. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but—" He paused, studying my face with an intensity that was unsettling. "You look just like my missing son." Before I could respond, the diner's bell jingled again. I turned to see Melissa storming in, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. Daniel trailed behind her like a shadow, his shoulders hunched. "Really, Harold?" Melissa's voice carried across the diner, turning heads. "Sitting here sulking in a public place? Do you think anyone cares about your sad little story?" The elderly man stepped back slightly, but didn't leave. Instead, I watched as his expression changed from curiosity to something harder as he observed Melissa's approach. "We weren't done talking," she continued, sliding into the booth across from me without invitation. "You need to sign these papers." She pulled documents from her designer purse, sliding them across the table. "It's a power of attorney. Daniel and I need to be able to make decisions for you. I stared at the papers, not touching them. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions, Melissa. Are you? Because running out in the middle of an important family discussion doesn't seem particularly rational to me. Daniel finally spoke up. Dad, it's just a precaution. You're getting older, and we want to make sure everything's taken care of. I looked at my son, feeling a deep sadness settle in my chest. Taken care of? Or taken away? The elderly stranger still stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with increasing interest. His fingers tightened around the handle of his briefcase. Don't be dramatic, Melissa snapped. This is exactly why we need this document. You're becoming emotional and impractical. I'm not signing anything today, I said firmly, finding a small spark of resolve. I need to think. Melissa's perfect smile tightened. There's nothing to think about. This is happening, Harold. One way or another, you're going to have to accept that you can't manage alone anymore. The house will be sold, and you'll be comfortable in Cedar Grove assisted living. It's the sensible solution. My home is not for sale, I said quietly. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hiss. It will be. And do you know why? Because Daniel is your only family now. Without us, you have no one. You'll die alone, Harold. Alone and with nothing. I felt the words like physical blows, each one striking deep into wounds already raw from years of similar attacks. I looked at Daniel, silently pleading for him to say something, to defend me just once. He met my eyes briefly before looking away. Excuse me. The elderly man's voice cut through the tension. All three of us turned to look at him. I couldn't help overhearing, he continued, his blue eyes now locked on Melissa with unmistakable disapproval. And I believe I might have some information relevant to your discussion. This is a private family matter, Melissa said dismissively. Whatever you think you heard. My name is George Ellison, the man interrupted, pulling out a business card from his pocket and placing it on the table. I was Margaret Whitman's attorney. The diner seemed to go silent around us as he slowly opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I stared at the name on the business card. George Ellison, attorney at law. The edges were worn, the print slightly faded, but the address was unmistakably from our town. My heart began to race as I tried to place the name, to remember if Margaret had ever mentioned him. I don't understand, I said, my voice unsteady. Margaret's lawyer was William Porter. He handled her will, our estate planning, everything. George Ellison nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at me. William was the firm's, public face. I handled special cases, matters requiring discretion. He glanced at Melissa, whose perfect composure had started to crack around the edges. Margaret came to see me privately, about 7 years before she passed. This is ridiculous, Melissa cut in, her voice higher than usual. Daniel, we don't have time for this. Your father clearly needs to rest, and this stranger is taking advantage of his confusion. Daniel looked uncertain, glancing between me and George Ellison. Dad, do you know this man? I shook my head slowly. No, but I want to hear what he has to say. George Ellison carefully placed the folder on the table. May I sit down, Mr. Whitman? I nodded, and he slid into the booth beside me. The leather of the briefcase creaked as he settled it against his leg. There was something steadying about his presence, a quiet authority that even Melissa seemed reluctant to challenge directly. Margaret was a remarkable woman, George began, his voice taking on a respectful, almost reverent tone. She came to me because she had concerns about the future, specifically about what might happen to you and your estate after she was gone. She never mentioned you, I said, still struggling to process this revelation. She wanted it that way, George replied. She asked me to remain in the background unless certain conditions arose. He looked pointedly at Melissa. Conditions such as attempts to separate you from your home or assets against your wishes. Melissa's face flushed red. This is absurd. You have no right to interfere in our family decisions. Daniel, say something. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should hear him out, Melissa. George opened the folder, revealing documents with Margaret's familiar signature. Your wife was exceptionally intelligent, Mr. Whitman. She observed more than people realized and had a remarkable talent for anticipating potential problems. What exactly are you saying? I asked, my coffee, forgotten, growing cold beside me. I'm saying that Margaret created a secondary will and trust that would only activate under specific circumstances. He turned to a tabbed section in the folder. She left explicit instructions that if anyone attempted to force you from your home or take control of your assets against your wishes, certain provisions would immediately take effect. Betty appeared. With a fresh pot of coffee, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Can I get you folks anything else?" "No thank you, Betty," I said automatically, my attention fixed on the documents before me. As Betty retreated, George continued. "The house, your home, was transferred into an irrevocable trust 7 years ago. You are the beneficiary for your lifetime, with specific conditions for what happens afterward." He looked directly at Melissa as he delivered the next words. "The house was never yours to sell." The color drained from Melissa's face. "That's not possible. We've seen Harold's will. The house passes to Daniel." "The will you've seen was deliberately kept in place as a test of sorts," George explained. "Margaret wanted to see what choices would be made when people thought there was something to gain." I felt a wave of emotions wash over me. Shock, confusion, and beneath it all, a growing sense of wonder at my late wife's foresight. Even from beyond the grave, Margaret was protecting me. "I don't believe any of this," Melissa said, but her voice lacked conviction. "These could be fake documents. You could be anyone. Feel free to contact the county records office," George said calmly. "The trust filings are public record, though deliberately obscured under Margaret's maiden name. I have the reference numbers here." He slid a small card toward Daniel. "You'll find everything is quite legitimate." Daniel picked up the card, studying it with a troubled expression. "Dad, did you know about any of this?" I shook my head, still trying to process the revelation. "Your mother and I shared everything, or so I thought." George turned to me with gentle eyes. "She didn't keep this from you out of mistrust, Mr. Whitman. She did it to protect you from having to choose between your principles and your family. She knew you would always try to see the best in everyone, especially your son." "This is emotional manipulation," Melissa insisted, but her voice had lost its edge. "Daniel, we're leaving. We'll have our own attorney review this nonsense." "Before you go," George said, turning to another section of the folder, "you should know there's more. The trust contains specific provisions regarding attempts to obtain power of attorney or guardianship over Mr. Whitman without clear medical necessity." He pulled out another document, this one with a red seal at the bottom. "Any such attempts trigger an immediate review by the trust's appointed guardian ad litem, which happens to be me, and can result in the permanent disinheritance of those involved." Daniel's face paled. "Disinheritance?" George nodded solemnly. "Margaret was very specific about protecting her husband's autonomy and dignity. She believed that anyone who would try to take control from him while he was still capable did not have his best interests at heart." Melissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is blackmail. Daniel, we're leaving. Now." Daniel hesitated, looking at me with confusion in his eyes. "Dad, go," I said softly. "Take some time to think about everything." As they left, Melissa storming ahead, Daniel following reluctantly, the diner gradually returned to its normal hum of conversation. I turned to George, who was carefully returning the documents to his folder. "Why did you say I look like your missing son?" I asked, remembering his strange opening line. A sad smile crossed his weathered face. "Because you do. My boy left home 30 years ago after an argument. I never saw him again." He closed the briefcase with a soft click. "When I saw you sitting here, looking so defeated, something in me recognized that same lost expression my son had the day he walked out." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "Don't be. It gave me the courage to approach you, which was necessary. I've been watching your situation for some time, waiting for the right moment to reveal Margaret's arrangements. I promised her I would look after you if the need arose." I looked around the diner, at the worn booths, the flickering neon, the familiar faces, and felt something shift inside me. For the first time since Margaret died, I didn't feel completely alone. "Thank you," I said simply. George nodded, understanding in his pale blue eyes. "Margaret once told me that the true measure of love isn't just what we do in life, but the protections we leave behind. She loved you very much, Mr. Whitman." As we sat there, two old men surrounded by the ghosts of our pasts, I felt Margaret's presence more strongly than I had in years, and with it came something I'd thought Melissa had permanently taken from me: hope. 3 days passed before I heard from Daniel. 3 days of sitting in Margaret's favorite armchair, staring at old photographs, trying to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the one who had secretly created an elaborate safety net to catch me if I fell. The house felt different somehow. Not just mine anymore, but ours still. Margaret's presence lingering in every careful provision she'd made. When the doorbell rang that Wednesday afternoon, I wasn't surprised to see Daniel standing on the porch alone, his shoulders hunched against the October chill. His eyes were bloodshot, the circles beneath them darker than before. "Can I come in, Dad?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I stepped aside without a word, letting him enter the home he'd grown up in, the home his wife had been so eager to sell out from under me. He moved tentatively, like a visitor rather than a son, pausing to look at the family photos lining the hallway. "Coffee?" I offered, maintaining the polite distance that had grown between us over the years. He nodded, following me into the kitchen where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals, where I'd taught him to scramble eggs when he could barely reach the stove. He sat at the table while I went through the familiar motions of brewing coffee, the silence stretching between us. "Melissa's furious," he finally said as I set a steaming mug before him. "She's been calling attorneys all over town." "And what have they told her?" I asked, taking the seat across from him. Daniel stared into his coffee. "That the trust is ironclad. Mom knew exactly what she was doing." He looked up at me, his eyes searching. "Did you really have no idea?" I shook my head slowly. "Your mother was entitled to her secrets, especially ones meant to protect me. From me?" The hurt in his voice was genuine. "Did she think I needed to be stopped from helping you?" "Not from you, son. From influence over you." I took a sip of my coffee, choosing my next words carefully. "Your mother watched how Melissa spoke to me, how decisions were made in your household. She wasn't blind." Daniel flinched, as if I'd struck him. "I never meant for things to get this way. Few people do. We don't notice the small compromises until they've built a wall too high to see over." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his teenage years that it made my chest ache. "I don't know what to do, Dad. Melissa wants to contest the trust, claims Mom wasn't of sound mind when she created it. Is that what you believe?" I asked quietly. "No." The word came quickly, at least giving me that small comfort. Mom was sharper than all of us, right until the end. We sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the kitchen clock marking the seconds. Outside, leaves rustled against the window, golden and red, Margaret's favorite time of year. "There's something else," Daniel finally said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Mr. Ellison delivered this to my office this morning. It's addressed to both of us in Mom's handwriting." My heart stuttered at the sight of Margaret's neat script. Even 3 years after her passing, seeing her handwriting felt like catching a glimpse of her turning a corner, a ghost I could almost touch. Daniel handed me the envelope. "I haven't opened it. I thought we should read it together." My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, the kind Margaret had always saved for important letters. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing it against the tabletop. "My dearest boys, if you're reading this, then 2 things have happened. I've left this world sooner than any of us would wish, and the trust I created has been revealed. I imagine you're both feeling confused, perhaps even betrayed by my secrecy. Harold, my love, please understand that keeping this from you wasn't about trust, but about sparing you conflict. You've always seen the best in people, especially our son. I didn't want to force you to choose between protecting yourself and keeping peace in the family. Daniel, since you were small, your father has put your happiness above his own, often at great personal cost. The older I got, the more I watched you pull away, allowing influences into your life that changed your perspective on what family means. This letter isn't meant to assign blame, but to remind you both of something essential. Value isn't measured in property or possessions. It's found in how we honor our commitments to those who shaped us, in the dignity we afford each other, especially in disagreement. The provisions I've made aren't meant as punishment, but as protection for the values our family was built upon. Harold deserves to live out his days in the home we created together, surrounded by memories rather than stripped of them for financial convenience. Daniel, your inheritance was never meant to be the house itself, but the example of the man who built it for his family. Reclaim that inheritance while you can. It's worth far more than property. With all my love and hope for healing, Margaret. The kitchen fell silent as we finished reading. I looked up to see tears tracking down Daniel's face, the first I'd seen since his mother's funeral. He made no move to wipe them away. "She knew," he whispered. "All these years. She saw what was happening, what I was becoming." I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine, a gesture that had once been commonplace between us. "She saw everything, including the good man still inside you." Daniel's hand turned over, gripping mine with surprising strength. I'm so sorry, Dad. I don't know how we got here. How I let Melissa convince me that selling your home was for your own good. People can rationalize almost anything if the story they tell themselves is convincing enough, I said gently. Your mother understood that better than most. What happens now? He asked, sounding more like the uncertain boy who used to come to me with skinned knees than the confident professional Melissa had shaped him into. That depends on what you want, son. Daniel took a deep breath, straightening in his chair. I want to fix this, somehow. And Melissa? A shadow crossed his face. She's still talking about contesting the trust. Says we should get statements from Mom's doctors. Prove she wasn't thinking clearly. And what do you think about that plan? Daniel looked around the kitchen, at the height marks on the doorframe tracking his growth, at the dent in the cabinet from when he'd tried to help install new handles as a teenager, at the windowsill where Margaret had always kept fresh herbs in small clay pots that I still maintained. I think, he said slowly, that Mom knew exactly what she was doing, and I think it's time I started making my own decisions again. I felt a weight lift from my chest. Not everything, but enough to take a deeper breath than I had in years. Would you like more coffee? I asked, the simple domestic question somehow bridging the chasm between us better than any grand declaration could. Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yes, and maybe you could show me how to fix that leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. I never did learn how to do it properly. I'd like that, I said, rising to refill our mugs. As I stood at the counter, my back to my son, I felt Margaret's presence so strongly it nearly brought me to my knees. You were right, I thought, sending the words to wherever she might be. You were right about everything. The afternoon with Daniel stretched into evening. We fixed the leaky faucet together, his hands relearning the patient work of home repair that I'd tried to teach him years ago. Conversation came easier with tools between us, focusing on washers and pipe wrenches rather than the fractured relationship we were tentatively trying to mend. Do you remember helping me build the treehouse? I asked as we packed away the tools. Daniel smiled, a genuine expression I hadn't seen in years. You let me hammer actual nails when I was 8. Mom nearly had a heart attack when she found out. She made me promise to supervise every swing. I chuckled, the memory warming me. But she understood why it mattered. Building something with your hands teaches patience, shows you that broken things can be fixed with enough care. Daniel's smile faded. Some things are harder to fix than leaky faucets. Harder, yes. Impossible, no. I closed the toolbox with a decisive click. Your mother believed that, right until the end. As darkness fell, Daniel checked his phone, grimacing at the screen. 12 missed calls from Melissa. You should go, I said, understanding the conflict he faced. This won't be resolved in one afternoon. He nodded, following me downstairs. At the front door, he paused, looking uncertain. Dad, I need to ask you something. The trust. What exactly does it say about me? About inheritance? The question hung between us, loaded with implications. I studied my son's face, trying to gauge his motivation. What I saw wasn't the calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing when financial matters arose, but genuine concern. George is coming by tomorrow to explain everything in detail, I said carefully, but the main provision is that the house and Margaret's personal savings stay in the trust during my lifetime. After that, it depends. On what? On choices, son. Not just one big choice, but the small, daily ones that show character. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Come by tomorrow at 4. We'll talk it through with George. Daniel nodded, embracing me briefly, before stepping out into the night. I watched him walk to his car, shoulders straighter than when he'd arrived, and felt a cautious hope take root. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. I dreamed of Margaret, young and vibrant, tending to her garden while laughing at something I'd said. When the dream faded, I didn't wake with the usual hollow ache, but with a strange sense of purpose. The morning brought a crisp brightness that matched my mood. I spent the hours before George's arrival cleaning the house with more energy than I'd felt in years, opening windows to let the autumn air sweep through rooms that had been too still, too quiet for too long. George arrived precisely at 3, his leather briefcase now familiar, almost comforting in its solidity. He nodded, approvingly as he entered the freshly tidied living room. You look better, Harold, he observed, settling into an armchair. Less haunted. I feel better, I admitted. Reading Margaret's letter, it was like having her back for a moment. Her foresight was remarkable. George's eyes crinkled with a sad smile. She was an exceptional woman. When she first approached me about creating the trust, I tried to convince her to discuss it with you openly. She was adamant that shielding you from that knowledge was an act of love. It was, I agreed. She knew I would have struggled with the implications, that our son might someday try to take advantage. George opened his briefcase, extracting the now familiar folder. Daniel is coming today? At 4. He has questions about the trust. Provisions. George nodded, spreading documents across the coffee table. Good. It's better to have everything transparent now. That was always Margaret's intention. Not secrecy for its own sake, but timed revelation when it would do the most good. As George walked me through the trust's details, I marveled at Margaret's thoroughness. The house was protected, as were our savings. But what struck me most were the conditions she'd established for Daniel's eventual inheritance. She created a series of benchmarks, George explained, pointing to a section of dense legal text. Not financial ones, but evidence of character and care. Regular visits to you, demonstrated respect for your autonomy, protection of your dignity in your later years. She was quite specific. And if he doesn't meet these benchmarks, then the house and remaining assets go to the scholarship fund Margaret established at the community college, the one that helps single parents complete their education. I shook my head in wonder. She thought of everything. She believed in consequences, but also in redemption, George said, turning to another document. There are provisions for Daniel to demonstrate changed behavior over time. The doorbell rang at 4 o'clock sharp. When I opened it, I found not only Daniel on the porch, but Melissa as well, her expression a carefully composed mask of cordiality that didn't reach her eyes. I hope you don't mind that I came along, she said, her voice honeyed with false warmth. This concerns our family's future, after all. Before I could respond, George appeared, behind me. Actually, Mrs. Whitman, I'm glad you're here. It saves us having multiple conversations. Please, come in. Melissa's smile faltered slightly at George's formal tone, but she maintained her composure as they entered. She looked around the living room with new eyes, not calculating its market value, but seeming to truly see it for the first time. The worn comfort of well-loved furniture, the photos chronicling a family's history, the hand-knitted Afghan Margaret had made during her final winter. Mr. Ellison, she greeted George with a tight nod. I've been consulting with our attorney about this unusual situation. I imagine you have, George replied mildly, gesturing for them to sit. And I imagine he told you the trust is unassailable. Daniel sat beside Melissa on the sofa, but I noticed he kept a slight distance between them. The tension in the room was palpable as George resumed his place in the armchair, retrieving his reading glasses from his pocket. Shall we begin? He asked, his voice taking on the professional tone of the attorney he was. I think it's time we all understood exactly what Margaret Whitman intended for her family's future. George adjusted his reading glasses, the afternoon light catching on the frames as he arranged the documents before him. The room had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the usual creaks and sighs of the old house seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Margaret created this trust with very specific intentions, George began, his tone measured and clear. She called it the Whitman Family Legacy Trust, and its primary purpose is to protect both Harold's well-being and the values she believed defined your family. Melissa shifted on the sofa, her designer purse clutched tightly in her lap, and she felt the need to do this behind everyone's back. That doesn't strike you as suspicious, Mr. Ellison? George regarded her calmly over his glasses. Margaret consulted with her oncologist, her primary physician, and underwent a psychological evaluation before finalizing these documents. All 3 certified her to be of sound mind and clear purpose. Those certifications are filed with the trust. He slid a stapled packet toward her. You're welcome to review them. Melissa didn't touch the papers, but I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the realization that her planned challenge to Margaret's mental capacity would go nowhere. Now, as to the specific provisions, George continued, turning to a tabbed section. The house remains in the trust during Harold's lifetime. He has full rights to live in it, maintain it, or even rent it if he chooses to downsize or relocate. The trust pays the property taxes and provides funds for maintenance and repairs. And after his time? Daniel asked, his voice catching slightly. George looked directly at him. That's where your mother's wisdom truly shines. The inheritance isn't automatic, Daniel. It's earned. Earned? Melissa's voice sharpened. What does that mean? It means, George said, that Margaret established a series of benchmarks that demonstrate genuine care and respect for Harold in his later years. Regular visits, inclusion in family events, protection of his dignity and autonomy, respect for his home and memories. He turned the page, continuing. An independent trustee, currently myself, evaluates these benchmarks annually. If Daniel consistently meets them over a period of at least 3 years prior to Harold's passing, then yes, the house and remaining assets transfer to him. And if not, Daniel asked quietly, then everything goes to the Margaret Whitman Second Chance Scholarship at Riverside Community College, the program that helps single parents complete their education. Melissa's face flushed red. This is emotional manipulation. She's controlling everyone from the grave. I prefer to think of it as incentivizing decency, George replied mildly. But semantics aside, these are the legal provisions. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. So even if we change how we treat Dad now, we have to maintain it for years to have any claim? Yes. Margaret was very clear that she wanted genuine change, not performative behavior, just long enough to secure an inheritance. I watched my son's face as he absorbed this, searching for signs of the calculation I'd seen so often in recent years, the cost-benefit analysis that seemed to guide his interactions with me. What I saw instead surprised me. Not anger or resentment, but shame mingled with something like respect. She knew me better than I know myself, he murmured, more to himself than to us. Melissa stood abruptly, pacing to the window. This is absurd. Daniel, we can fight this. It's clearly coercion. Is it? Daniel asked, looking up at her with new clarity in his eyes. Or is it just consequences? George cleared his throat. There's one more provision you should be aware of. He removed a sealed envelope from the folder. Margaret left this with instructions that it be opened only if there was an attempt to contest the trust or obtain guardianship over Harold without medical necessity. Melissa froze by the window, her back stiffening. What is that? I don't know, George said honestly. It's sealed, and I'm bound by attorney-client privilege to open it only under the conditions specified. He placed it on the coffee table, where it sat like a silent accusation. Margaret indicated that its contents would be illuminating regarding certain financial arrangements within your marriage. The color drained from Melissa's face. She looked at Daniel, then at the envelope, then back at her husband. Whatever passed between them in that silent exchange remained their secret, but I watched understanding dawn on my son's face, followed by a weariness that aged him visibly. We won't be contesting the trust, Daniel said firmly, his eyes still locked with Melissa's. Any of it. George nodded, returning the envelope to his folder. A wise decision. Melissa grabbed her purse, her movements jerky with suppressed emotion. I need some air. Daniel, we'll discuss this at home. She headed for the door without looking at me, her heels striking the hardwood like angry punctuation marks. When the front door slammed behind her, Daniel let out a long, shaky breath. I'm sorry about that. No need to apologize, George said, gathering his papers. Family dynamics are rarely simple, especially where inheritance is concerned. Daniel ran a hand over his face. It's not about the inheritance. Not really. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. It's about who I became when I wasn't paying attention. I moved to sit beside my son, the sofa cushion dipping under my weight. We all drift sometimes. The important thing is noticing before you're too far from shore. George stood, sensing the need for privacy. I'll leave the trust documents with you to review at your leisure. My contact information is on the front page if you have any questions. I walked him to the door, grateful beyond words for his steady presence these past few days. Thank you doesn't seem adequate. He clasped my shoulder briefly. No thanks needed. I made a promise to Margaret. His eyes crinkled with a sad smile. Besides, it's been healing, in a way. Helping you has helped me come to terms with my own family estrangement. After George left, I returned to find Daniel studying the family photos on the mantel, images of happier times when our roles were simpler. Father and son, protector and protected. Mom kept this one in her purse, he said softly, picking up a small frame containing a photo of him at about 10, grinning widely despite a missing front tooth, his arm thrown around my shoulders as we stood beside the partially built treehouse. I saw it when she was in the hospital. She looked at it every day. She never lost faith in you, I said. Neither did I. Daniel set the photo down carefully. I don't deserve that faith. That's not how faith works, son. It's not earned. It's given. Freely. He turned to me, the afternoon light casting half his face in shadow. I don't know if I can fix things with Melissa. The envelope George mentioned, there are things you don't know. I don't need to. No, I assured him. That's between you and her. But it affects you, he insisted. The way we've treated you, the pressure to sell this house. It wasn't just about what made logical sense. He hesitated, then continued in a rush. Melissa's been hiding debt. A lot of it. The house equity was supposed to solve that problem. The revelation didn't shock me as much as it might have once. Financial troubles can make people desperate, but they don't have to make them cruel. No, Daniel agreed quietly. That part was a choice. Our choice. He looked around the living room, at the life his mother and I had built. I need to make different choices now. What will you do? I don't know yet, but I'm going to start by remembering who I was before I lost my way. He picked up his jacket, moving toward the door. Is it okay if I come by tomorrow? Maybe we could work on the garage shelves like we talked about last year? I'd like that, I said, following him to the porch. As Daniel drove away, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink that Margaret would have loved. I stood watching until his car disappeared around the corner, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not quite hope, not quite peace, but perhaps the first tentative steps toward both. The next morning, I woke to the sound of raised voices drifting through my open bedroom window. Pulling on my robe, I moved to the window to see Daniel and Melissa standing beside their car in my driveway, engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument. Their gestures were sharp, their postures rigid with tension. Even from a distance, I could see the strain on my son's face as Melissa jabbed a finger at him, then toward my house. I stepped back from the window, giving them privacy for a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Daniel stood alone on the porch, a tool bag in one hand, a bakery box in the other, and dark circles under his eyes that told their own story. I brought breakfast, he said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And my tools. Thought we might get started on those garage shelves. I accepted the peace offerings for what they were. Coffee's already on. Come in. We ate cheese Danish at the kitchen table, the pastry flaky and sweet but somehow tasteless in the shadow of the obvious question hanging between us. I waited, letting Daniel find his own time to speak. Melissa wants a separation, he finally said, setting down his coffee mug with a careful precision that betrayed his effort to stay composed. She says I've changed overnight, that I'm not the man she married. I'm sorry, I offered, meaning it despite everything. No one's pain had ever brought me joy. Not even hers. Daniel shook his head. Don't be. She's right, in a way. I have changed. I'm remembering who I was before I started seeing the world through her lens. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. The thing is, Dad, I'm not sure I like who I became with her. The way I've treated you these past few years. It's not who Mom raised me to be. Marriage changes people, I said. Carefully. Compromise is necessary. Compromise, yes. Betrayal, no. He pushed his plate away, appetite gone. Last night, after we left here, Melissa was furious. She kept talking about fighting the trust, about hiring another lawyer who might find a loophole. He drew a deep breath. When I told her I wouldn't challenge Mom's wishes, she threatened to leave. And that's what you were discussing outside just now? Daniel nodded. She came to make one last attempt to convince me. Said if I really loved her, I'd fight for our future, meaning the house equity. When I refused, she took off her ring. His voice cracked slightly. 10 years of marriage ended in a driveway argument. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. I'm truly sorry, son. Whatever her faults. I know you loved her. Did I? He asked, the question seemingly directed at himself. Or did I just get used to the life we built? The status, the connections, the image? He looked around the kitchen, at the worn linoleum floor and dated cabinets that Melissa had always subtly mocked. I think somewhere along the way, I forgot what real value looks like. We sat in silence for a moment, the old kitchen clock ticking steadily on the wall, marking time as it had through countless family meals, midnight snacks, and morning coffees. What happens now? I finally asked. Legally, I don't know. Personally, he straightened his shoulders slightly. I start rebuilding. My life, my self-respect. He met my gaze directly. My relationship with my father. The simple declaration, spoken without dramatic flourish, hit me harder than any emotional scene could have. I felt my throat tighten with emotion I'd long suppressed. I'd like that very much, I managed. Daniel stood clearing our plates with the easy familiarity of someone who'd grown up in this kitchen. So those garage shelves won't build themselves, shall we? We spent the day working side by side, measuring twice and cutting. Once, the rhythm of physical labor creating a space where conversation could flow naturally. We talked about small things at first: sports teams, weather, neighborhood changes. Gradually, the conversation deepened. Mom would have loved seeing us like this, Daniel said as we secured the last shelf bracket, working together, building something. She always said her favorite sound was the two of us laughing in the garage, I recalled, the memory warming me from within. Said it was better than any symphony. I remember that. Daniel handed me a screwdriver. She used to bring us lemonade in the summer, those big glasses with extra ice, and hot chocolate in winter, with the tiny marshmallows you loved. Daniel smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. She never forgot the marshmallows. Not once. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Betty from the diner called. Harold, it's Betty. I just thought you should know. Your daughter-in-law's been in here all day, talking to anyone who'll listen about contesting some trust and looking for dirt on that Ellison fellow who stood up for you. My stomach sank. Thanks for letting me know, Betty. Folks aren't buying what? She's selling? Betty continued, her voice lowering conspiratorially. Everyone here remembers how good you and Margaret were to this community, how you fixed cars for half price when people were struggling, how she tutored kids for free. After thanking her again, I hung up and relayed the conversation to Daniel. His face hardened. I'm sorry, Dad. I'll talk to her. It won't help, I said, gently. She's fighting for survival the only way she knows how. Daniel looked at me with newfound respect. How can you be so understanding after everything she's said about you? I considered this as I put away the tools, each returning to its proper place on the pegboard, a system Margaret had designed years ago. Anger requires energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. Besides, I added, your mother taught me something important. Those who try to diminish others are usually fighting desperate battles within themselves. The sun was setting when Daniel's phone rang. He checked the screen, his expression tightening. It's Melissa's sister. I should take this. He stepped onto the porch, his voice a murmur through the screen door. When he returned, his face was pale. Melissa's been in an accident. Nothing life-threatening, but she's at Riverside Memorial. Her sister says she's asking for me. I nodded, already reaching for my car keys. I'll drive you. Dad, you don't have to. Family shows up, I said simply. Even when it's hard. Maybe especially then. The drive to the hospital was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As I pulled into the emergency room parking lot, Daniel turned to me. Whatever happens in there, with Melissa, with us, I want you to know something. His voice was steady, determined. I'm going to be better. The son you deserve, the man Mom believed I could be. I gripped his shoulder briefly. You already are, son. You already are. As Daniel disappeared through the sliding hospital doors, I sat in the car, watching the lights of the emergency room blur through the windshield. Sometimes braking was necessary before rebuilding could begin. Margaret had understood that, planning for it even from beyond the veil of death. You were right, I whispered to her memory, taking comfort in the belief that somehow, somewhere, she could hear me. You were right about everything. The hospital waiting room was painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seems designed to neither comfort nor distress. A neutral backdrop for the full spectrum of human emotion that unfolds within its walls. I sat alone, a paper cup of mediocre coffee cooling between my palms, watching the parade of worried faces come and go while I waited for Daniel. An hour passed before he emerged from the double doors that led to the emergency department. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but there was a strange peace in his expression that hadn't been there before. How is she? I asked, rising to meet him. Physically, some cuts and bruises, a mild concussion. She swerved to avoid a deer and hit a guardrail. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Emotionally, I've never seen her so undone. We walked slowly toward the exit, our footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. What happened in there? I ventured carefully. Daniel pushed through the automatic doors, inhaling deeply as we stepped into the cool night air. Something I never expected, he said finally. Vulnerability. Truth. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the parking lot lights. Melissa was crying when I got there, not from pain but from shame. She said nearly dying. Made her see how empty her life had become, how hollow her values were. People often find clarity in moments of crisis, I observed as we reached the car. This felt different, Dad. Genuine. Daniel leaned against the passenger door, making no move to get in. She confessed everything. The hidden debt, the credit cards I didn't know about, the real reason she's been pushing so hard to sell your house. And what was the real reason? Her parents lost everything in that investment scheme last year, the one that made the national news. They've been living on Melissa's secret loans, trying to maintain appearances while drowning financially. He shook his head. Pride and desperation make a dangerous combination. I thought of Margaret's sealed envelope in George's possession, the one that had frightened Melissa so thoroughly. Did she mention what she thought was in your mother's sealed letter? The one George has? Daniel nodded. She assumed it was evidence of the money she'd taken from our accounts for her parents. She was terrified of being exposed, of me discovering how deep the deception went. A sad smile crossed his face. The irony is, if she'd just been honest with me from the beginning, I would have helped her parents willingly. We got into the car, but I made no move to start the engine, sensing Daniel had more to say. I forgave her, Dad, he said quietly. Not for her sake, but for mine. Carrying anger is too heavy a burden. The simple wisdom in his words, so reminiscent of Margaret's philosophy, tightened my throat with emotion. Your mother would be proud of that decision. I learned it from watching you these past few days, Daniel replied. You had every right to be bitter after how we treated you, but instead you showed compassion, even driving me to see the woman who tried to take your home. I started the car, the engine's hum filling the silence between us. Compassion doesn't mean allowing mistreatment to continue. It just means recognizing the humanity in those who hurt us. That's the distinction I missed for so long, Daniel admitted as we pulled out of the parking lot. I thought keeping the peace meant accepting disrespect. I confused compliance with kindness. The streets were nearly empty at this late hour, streetlights casting pools of gold on the asphalt. As we drove, Daniel shared more about his conversation with Melissa, how they had agreed to a peaceful separation, how she had expressed genuine remorse for her treatment of me, how the accident had shaken loose something calcified within her. She asked if she could apologize to you in person, he said as we turned onto my street. I told her that would be your decision, not mine. I considered this as we pulled into the driveway, the headlights briefly illuminating the front of the house Margaret and I had lovingly maintained for decades. I'd be willing to hear her out, I said finally, not for her sake, but for closure. For all of us. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, autumn asserting itself in earnest. I was tending to Margaret's perennial garden, preparing the beds for winter as she had taught me, when George's car pulled up to the curb. Hope I'm not interrupting, he called as he made his way up the path, briefcase in hand. Not at all, I replied, brushing soil from my knees as I stood. Just putting the garden to bed for the season. Margaret would haunt me if I neglected her peonies. George chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. She was particular about her flowers. I remember she brought a bouquet to my office every spring, said, legal papers needed the counterbalance of something alive and beautiful. We settled in the kitchen, where I poured coffee into the mugs Margaret had collected from small-town diners during our cross-country drive for our 40th anniversary. I heard about Melissa's accident, George said, accepting the steaming cup. Betty at the diner is quite the information clearinghouse. Small towns, nodded. Nothing stays private for long. Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. George opened his briefcase and removed a familiar sealed envelope, the one he'd mentioned containing information about Melissa's financial dealings. There's something you should know about this. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. It's empty, George said simply. Empty? I echoed, confused. George nodded, sliding the envelope across the table. Margaret never put anything inside. It was a bluff. A perfectly legal one, I might add. She suspected that whoever might try to take advantage of you would likely have secrets they wouldn't want exposed. The mere suggestion of documentation was enough to apply pressure at the right moment. I opened the envelope, confirming its emptiness, then began to laugh. A deep, genuine laugh that seemed to come from somewhere long dormant within me. It was so like Margaret, practical, perceptive, and just a little bit mischievous. She was remarkable, I said when I could speak again. Indeed she was, George agreed, his expression softening with memory. Which reminds me, there's something else she wanted you to have, when the time was right. He removed a small box from his briefcase, wrapped in simple blue paper. She said you'd know when that time had arrived. I took the package, feeling its negligible weight in my palm. And you think that time is now? George gestured around us, at the freshly tended garden visible through the window, at the toolbox still open from yesterday's project with Daniel, at the family photos I'd recently brought out of storage and returned to their places of honor throughout the house. You're reclaiming your life, Harold, building bridges instead of burning them, finding strength in compassion rather than bitterness. His pale blue eyes, so intense when we first met at the diner, crinkled with warmth. Yes, I believe the time has come. After George left, I sat at the kitchen table, turning the small package over in my hands. Whatever was inside had been waiting for years, chosen by Margaret in her final months, preserved by George until this moment. With careful fingers, I unwrapped the blue paper to reveal a small wooden box I recognized immediately. Margaret's grandfather's handcrafted jewelry box, which had once held her mother's wedding ring. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not jewelry, but a bice. Simple brass key attached to a handwritten note in Margaret's elegant script. Harold, my love, if you're reading this, you've weathered the storm I feared might come. This key opens the small safe in the attic, behind the Christmas decorations. Inside is a journal I kept during my final year, not of illness, but of gratitude. One entry for each year of our marriage, recalling a moment that made me certain I had chosen the right man to share my life. My final gift to you is not the past, but permission for the future. Live fully, love again if your heart allows it, and know that my love for you transcends even death. Forever yours, Margaret. I clutched the key to my chest, tears flowing freely down my face for the first time since her funeral. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the maple tree we'd planted on our 10th anniversary, now tall and magnificent, its leaves beginning their transformation from green to gold. It was time to climb into the attic and recover Margaret's final gift. Not just the journal, but the future she had so lovingly prepared me to face, even in her absence. 6 months passed in a gentle parade of small but meaningful changes. The harshness of winter gave way to a tentative spring, mirroring the cautious renewal happening within our fractured family. Daniel followed through on his promise to rebuild our relationship. Every Sunday afternoon found him at my door, sometimes with tools for household projects, other times simply with conversation and company. He moved into a small apartment across town after finalizing his separation from Melissa, focusing on rediscovering himself outside the identity he'd constructed during their marriage. The most unexpected development came 3 months after Melissa's accident. She asked to meet me at Riverside Diner, the very place where George had first approached me with Margaret's trust. I agreed, more curious than apprehensive. She was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, looking different than I remembered. Her designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, her immaculate makeup subdued, her posture less rigid with self-importance. "Thank you for coming," she said as I slid into the booth across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I admitted, accepting the coffee Betty poured without being asked. Melissa wrapped her hands around her own mug, her knuckles white with tension. "I owe you an apology, Harold. A big one." The words seemed to cost her, but she pushed forward. "The things I said to you, the way I treated you, there's no excuse for it." "What about an explanation?" I asked, neither accepting nor rejecting her apology yet. She nodded, drawing a deep breath. Pride, fear, the desperate need to maintain an image even as everything was crumbling around me. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "But mostly, envy." "Envy?" I echoed, genuinely surprised. "Of what you and Margaret had, that solid foundation, that unwavering respect." Her voice wavered slightly. "I grew up watching my parents tear each other down, using money as both weapon and shield. I thought success meant accumulation of wealth, status, property. I never understood that what you had was the real success." We talked for over an hour. Really talked, perhaps for the first time ever. She spoke of her ongoing therapy, of reconnecting with her parents on more honest terms, of the volunteer work she'd begun at a women's financial literacy program. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said as our conversation wound down. "I just wanted you to know that I see now what I was too blind to see before. The accident. It changed my perspective in ways I never anticipated." I considered her words, searching for insincerity and finding none. "Forgiveness isn't something earned, Melissa. It's something given, when both parties are ready. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm closer than I would have thought possible 6 months ago." She nodded, accepting this with a grace I wouldn't have attributed to her before. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." As spring deepened into summer, Daniel and I established new routines and resurrected old ones. We fished at the lake where I'd taught him to cast a line as a boy. We resumed our tradition of watching baseball games together, cheering and groaning in unison as our team fumbled or triumphed. And on warm, evenings, we sat on the porch Margaret had loved, reading passages from her gratitude journal, 1 year of our marriage at a time, savoring her observations about our shared life. George became a regular visitor, often joining us for Sunday dinners. He spoke more openly about his estranged son, sharing photographs and stories with a bittersweet mixture of pride and regret. In July, with Daniel's encouragement, George hired a private investigator to search for his missing son, not to force a reconciliation, but to offer one if it might be welcomed. It was on a golden afternoon in late September, almost exactly a year after that terrible day when Melissa had declared I would die with nothing, that George's phone call came. His son had been found in Oregon, alive and well, and cautiously open to reconnection. "He's coming here next month," George announced when he arrived for our weekly dinner, his face alight with tentative joy. "To talk, at least, to see if there's anything worth rebuilding." "There always is," Daniel said quietly, setting a platter of Margaret's famous pot roast on the table. "Always." After dinner, as dusk painted the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold, the three of us sat on the porch, 3 men at different stages of life, each navigating loss and renewal in our own way. "I've been thinking," I said into the comfortable silence, "about what it means to die with nothing." Daniel winced slightly at the reminder of Melissa's cruel words. "Not in the way you might think," I continued. "I've realized that the things we can lose, money, property, status, were never the real wealth to begin with." George nodded, understanding in his pale blue eyes. "The real inheritance isn't what's written in legal documents." "Exactly," I agreed, watching the first evening star appear above the maple tree Margaret and I had planted so long ago. "The true legacy is in connections that can't be severed by death or distance, in values that outlive us, in love that transforms even after it's gone." Daniel reached over, squeezing my shoulder gently. "Mom knew that all along." "She did," I smiled, feeling Margaret's presence in the gentle evening breeze, in the carefully tended garden, in the son who sat beside me. She left me with everything that matters and made sure I wouldn't lose it even in my darkest hour. As night settled around us, wrapping the old house in gentle darkness, I thought about the journey of this past year, from despair to renewal, from isolation to connection. The path hadn't been straight or easy, but each step had led me closer to understanding Margaret's final lesson, that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what possesses our hearts. What's truly ours, our dignity, our worth, our legacy, can never be stolen by the greedy, I said softly, voicing the truth I'd discovered. It can only be surrendered, and I refuse to surrender ever again. The 3 of us sat together under the vast canopy of stars, our silence comfortable, our futures uncertain but filled with possibility. I wasn't dying with nothing. I was living with everything that mattered. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Margaret was smiling,